The turbulence hit at 37,000 feet, which was not unusual for the approach into Colorado Springs in February, and the woman in seat 13F did not flinch. She had her eyes closed. Not sleeping, the slight tension in her jaw, the way her right hand rested on the armrest with fingers half-curled as though around a stick she wasn't holding, suggested something closer to controlled stillness than rest. She was 44 years old. She had gray in her dark hair that she had stopped pretending to manage 3 years ago. She wore civilian clothes, dark jeans, a navy pullover, a jacket folded on the seat beside her, and she looked, to the flight attendant who passed her twice without stopping, like someone traveling for business. Someone tired, someone ordinary. Her name was Myra Voss, her call sign was Wraith, and in 22 years of military service and 16 combat deployments across 4 different theaters of operation, she had never once been ordinary. The turbulence resolved, she opened her eyes. Outside the window, the landscape of the Front Range materialized through a thin ceiling of cloud, Pikes Peak wearing its February snow cap, the brown-gray of the high plains spreading east toward Kansas, the city of Colorado Springs arranged in orderly grids below like a mission briefing map. She had been here before. She had flown over this same terrain, though not at this altitude and not in anything that carried 237 passengers and complimentary beverages. She was flying commercial because her orders read proceed via most expedient means, and the most expedient means, this particular Thursday morning in February, was a direct flight from Atlanta that had boarded late and still somehow arrived 12 minutes ahead of schedule. The Air Force did not pay for first class. She had not asked for first class. She sat in 13F because that was the seat assignment on the ticket, and she was comfortable in coach because she had spent the last 2 decades in cockpits that made coach look spacious. The man in 13E had tried to make conversation twice. She had answered both questions politely, with enough warmth to be civil and enough brevity to close the door. He had eventually put in earbuds. She did not feel guilty about this. She had learned a long time ago that the energy required for social performance during transit was energy she could not afford to spend before a command briefing. The announcement came through the cabin speakers: "Please ensure your tray tables and seat backs are in their upright and locked positions. Estimated landing in approximately 14 minutes. The local time in Colorado Springs is 11:47 a.m. and the temperature is 31 degrees Fahrenheit." She began to gather herself. Jacket retrieved from the adjacent seat, folded across her lap. The small bag under the seat in front of her, she confirmed it was still latched with one practiced touch, not looking down. These were habits so embedded they required no conscious direction. 22 years of pre-landing checklists completed in aircraft that had actual checklists, and the habit had transferred to every mode of transport she had ever used since. She looked out the window again. The approach was bringing them down over Peterson Air Force Base, civilian airport and military base sharing the same infrastructure, which was common in this part of Colorado. She could see the military flight line from this altitude, the gray shapes of aircraft parked at specific intervals. The particular geometry of a working military airfield, which was different from a civilian airport, the way a working harbor was different from a marina, something about purpose made visible in the arrangement of every element. She noticed 2 F-22 Raptors taxiing. She noticed them the way she noticed everything, without particular investment, just the automatic cataloging of a person who spent decades reading the world through the glass of a cockpit. 2 Raptors, early patrol configuration, likely air defense mission out of the 302nd. Standard Thursday activity. She watched them without thinking much about it. Her mind had already moved on to the briefing, what General Harmon would need, what questions would be asked, what she should prepare to defend. She did not know yet that one of the pilots in those Raptors had just pulled up the passenger manifest on the military coordination channel. She did not know that he had found a name he recognized. She did not know that he had keyed his radio and said quietly to his wingman, "Look at this." She did not know that he had then said, with the particular gravity reserved for things that have crossed into legend, "Wraith is on that 737. She did not know any of this. She was, as far as she was aware, simply a passenger in seat 13F, 14 minutes from landing, reviewing the morning's agenda in her mind. The wheels touched Colorado Springs at 11:59, exactly on schedule. The aircraft decelerated with the smooth efficiency of a modern commercial airliner doing what it was built to do. She noted the runway condition, no visible ice, standard winter surface, and then reminded herself, not for the first time, that she was not flying this and her assessment was therefore irrelevant. The taxiway brought them around toward the terminal, standard approach route. She was watching out the window with the absent attention of someone who looks at familiar landscapes without really seeing them when the aircraft slowed more than expected and stopped. The captain's voice came over the intercom. Smooth, professional, calibrated for minimal alarm. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to hold here for just a moment while some military traffic clears the taxiway. We appreciate your patience. There was a low murmur through the cabin, people checking watches. The man in 13E pulled out one earbud and craned his neck toward the window on the other side of the aircraft. Myra Voss looked out her window, and she saw the two F-22 Raptors. They were actually parked, positioned deliberately on the taxiway apron in a way that no military aircraft was positioned without specific intent, not taxiing to or from, not waiting for clearance. Positioned, both aircraft facing the same direction, both pilots visible in their cockpits. Both canopies open. And both pilots, she could see this from the window at this distance in the February light, both pilots standing in their ejection seats, which required a specific physical effort that pilots did not make without reason, their flight-suited figures rising above the canopy rails. They were standing at attention. She did not move for 4 seconds. Then she understood. They knew she was on this aircraft. She did not know how they knew. Manifest coordination channel, someone with access to something, but they knew. And they had positioned their aircraft on this taxiway and opened their canopies and stood in their cockpits in the February cold of Colorado Springs. Render a salute to a woman in seat 13F of a commercial 737 who had not worn a uniform today, and who had, for the duration of this flight, been entirely invisible. Her jaw tightened, not against emotion, against the specific pressure that came with being seen unexpectedly and without warning after years of accustoming yourself to invisibility. The man in 13E had found the window now. "What is that?" he said to no one in particular. "Are those Air Force planes? Why are they stopped? Are they saluting the plane?" "They're saluting someone on the plane," said the woman across the aisle, who had been watching with more attention. The man in 13E turned to look at the woman in 13F, who was still looking out the window, whose expression had not changed, who had not moved. "Do you know what that's about?" he said. Myra Voss said nothing for a moment, then she said no. It was the first deliberate lie she had told in 3 years. She said it quietly, without inflection, and returned her attention to the window. Outside, the two pilots held their salute. She did not raise her hand. She did not wave. She did not acknowledge them in any way that the other passengers could see. But she held their gaze, the particular gaze of a pilot looking at pilots, distance be damned, the recognition that happened between people who had shared the same sky in the same capacity and survived, and she held it for the full duration. Then the captain's voice, "Okay, folks, we're cleared to continue. Thanks for your patience." The aircraft began to move. The Raptors held their position as the 737 taxied past. She watched them resolve from window view to nothing as the aircraft angled toward the terminal. She turned forward, folded her hands in her lap, felt the slight pressure behind her sternum that she associated with operational moments, not sentiment, not quite, but the physical registration of something that mattered. She was 44 years old. She had gray in her hair she had stopped managing. She was wearing civilian clothes and traveling coach because the Air Force did not pay for first class. And two F-22 pilots had stopped their aircraft, opened their canopies, and stood in the February cold to salute her call sign. She did not know what she had expected from this Thursday. She did not think she had expected this. The story of how Myra Voss became Wraith began 22 years earlier, in a country that no longer existed in the same form, and a cockpit that had no business surviving what it went through. She was born in Sarajevo in 1980, the second daughter of a man who taught mathematics at the university and a woman who played piano with the professional competence of someone who had trained for the concert stage and chosen, instead, the life of a teacher. The apartment was small. Books lined every wall that wasn't a window. She had grown up understanding that precision mattered in mathematics, in music, in the way you chose your words, and that imprecision was not a personality trait but an ethical failure. Her father said this. He said it about arithmetic, and he said it about language, and he said it, eventually, about aircraft. Because when she was 9 years old, he had taken her to an airshow, and she had stood in the grass in her good shoes watching a Yugoslav Air Force jet complete a low pass over the crowd, and something in her had organized itself around that moment with a finality that surprised both of them. If you enjoy these stories of military courage and tactical decision-making, please subscribe to the channel. We cover operations from every theater, every branch, and every generation of aviation. And leave a comment below. Have you ever encountered a moment where someone's reputation preceded them in a way that changed everything? Tell us what happened. She was 12 when the war came to Sarajevo. She was 22 years old before she permitted herself to think carefully about what those years had cost, and by then she was in the middle of flight school and the analysis was, in any practical sense, past its usefulness. What she remembered from those years and what she had never spoken about in any debrief or interview was the morning her father had taken her to the roof of their building while the city was under bombardment. He had a pair of binoculars. He was not a military man. He had no tactical purpose on that roof. What he had was a belief, stated calmly, as though it were an equation, that it was important to understand the shape of the thing that threatened you rather than hiding from it, because hiding gave you no information and information was the only thing that ever made the difference. Look, he had said, handing her the binoculars, tell me what you see. She had looked, she had described what she saw, the smoke from 3 different locations, the patterns of movement in the streets, the aircraft that circled briefly on the horizon before banking away. She had described it precisely because imprecision was an ethical failure. Good, he had said, what you can see you can plan around, what you cannot see will kill you, so the job is always to see. He was killed in 1995 in an attack that never made international news. A mortar round on a street he walked every day. The mathematics teacher who believed that precision was ethical, who had handed his daughter binoculars on a rooftop so she could learn to see. She had stood at his grave with her hands at her sides and made a promise with the specific, cold simplicity of someone who was done with sentiment. She would fly. She would matter. She would be the aircraft on the horizon that people saw and understood was between them and what threatened them. It had taken her 4 years after the war to get to flight training. It had taken another 3 years after that for anyone to take her seriously. It had taken her first combat deployment, Kosovo, in an old Yugoslav trainer repurposed for close air support, flying for a unit that had no reason to trust her and every reason to use her, for the call sign to come. Wraith was given to her by the enemy. The story, which circulated through intelligence summaries and was eventually confirmed by captured communications, was that opposing forces in the operational area had begun referring to a particular aircraft by a term that translated approximately to the ghost that flies low. The aircraft appeared without warning. It attacked with precision. It disappeared before countermeasures could respond. It had been seen and then it had not been seen, repeatedly, in ways that did not correspond to normal aircraft behavior. Her own unit had adopted the term with the straightforward appreciation that military units have for enemy recognition. Wraith, because you didn't see her coming, because by the time you knew she was there, the decision had already been made. She had never corrected the story. She had never explained the actual reason the attacks were precise and the approach was unexpected, which was simply that she had learned to see, really see, with the quality of attention her father had tried to teach her on a Sarajevo rooftop, in a way that the tactical situation demanded. There was no mystery to it. There was only the discipline of observation applied consistently over 16 deployments to 4 different theaters. But she had never corrected the story because the story served a purpose. And if the story had reached 2 F-22 pilots in Colorado Springs on a Thursday morning in February and had caused them to stand in their cockpits in the cold to render a salute to a woman in civilian clothes, then the story had served more purpose than she had calculated. She did not think about this at length. She did not permit herself to. She was 44 years old and she had a command briefing at 1300 hours and there was work to be done. Peterson Air Force Base, now Schriever-Peterson, had changed considerably in the years since her last assignment in Colorado. Buildings relocated, infrastructure upgraded, the particular evolution that military installations underwent when congressional funding cycled through renovation priorities. She walked through the terminal with her bag over one shoulder and found her way to the waiting vehicle with the efficiency of someone who had navigated dozens of military installations and had learned that the signage was always slightly wrong and the actual path was always determined by watching where other uniformed personnel were walking. The driver was a young airman who confirmed her name, rank, and destination with the clipped professionalism of someone recently trained in protocol. He did not ask questions. She sat in the back seat and watched Colorado Springs through the window. The briefing was in a building she had been to once before, 8 years ago, for a different reason. The hallway to the conference room had photographs on the walls, aircraft, operations, personnel. She did not look at the photographs. She had learned not to look at the photographs on institutional walls because she was sometimes in them. and seeing herself in photographs on walls produced a specific cognitive dissonance she found unproductive. General Diane Harmon was 61 years old and had commanded the Air Force Space Command before it became Space Force, and her particular area of expertise became a separate branch, at which point she had pivoted with the adaptability of someone who had been pivoting for 3 decades and had decided to outlast every institutional reorganization that came at her. She was small, precise, and spoke in sentences that were fully formed before they left her mouth. She reminded Myra, in a way she had never said aloud, of her father. Colonel Voss, General Harmon said, which was still the rank that felt most accurate even though Myra was, pending this briefing, something else. Thank you for coming on short notice. Not a problem, ma'am. The table was oval. 4 other officers seated, a brigadier general whose name Myra recognized from the strike command roster, a full colonel from the Air Education and Training Command, a civilian analyst whose badge indicated she was cleared higher than anyone else in the room, and a young major who was there to take notes. I'll be direct, General Harmon said. That's what you're here for. I appreciate that, ma'am. The 64th Aggressor Squadron at Nellis has been running below standard on DACT metrics for 18 months. I have 4 different commanders who have not been able to close the gap. The pilots are good, the aircraft are good. What is not good is the institutional culture of the squadron, which has calcified in a way that will take someone with a specific kind of authority to break open and rebuild. Myra said nothing. She waited. You wrote the Dissimilar Air Combat Training Methodology Update that AETC adopted in 2019, General Harmon continued. You've commanded 2 training units, both of which exceeded readiness metrics within 12 months of your assumption of command. And you have a reputation in the operational community that, she paused, one precise beat, precedes you in ways that will be useful in this context. The Aggressor Squadron, Myra said. Command of the 64th with a mandate to rebuild from the standards up. Full authority over syllabus, instructor selection, evaluation criteria, and within existing regulations, cultural expectations. What happened to the current commander? Reassigned to a position where his particular strengths are better employed. General Harmon's tone was neutral in a way that communicated everything necessary about the nature of the reassignment. He is a competent officer. He was not the right officer for this particular assignment. Myra thought about this for 3 seconds, which was long enough to reach the conclusion she had reached before she walked into this room, because she had read between the lines of the vague orders and the sudden recall and the command briefing and known, more or less, what was coming. What's the timeline? She asked. Report date is the 1st of next month. You'll have 60 days to assess before I expect a rebuilding plan. Full authority, full resources, full institutional backing from this command. And the politics. There will be some. General Harmon said this without apology, which was the appropriate way to say it. The 64th has institutional connections that will not be pleased to see their preferences disrupted. You are authorized to disrupt them anyway. Understood. Interested. She did not hesitate. Yes, ma'am, absolutely. General Harmon nodded, one clean nod that closed that chapter of the conversation. Good. Major Lindqvist will give you the full brief package. I have 30 minutes before my next obligation, and I'd like to use them to talk about what you're actually walking into. I'd appreciate that, ma'am. She was walking back to the vehicle 2 hours later when the young Major Lindqvist, who had done his briefing job with efficiency and then lingered with the specific uncertainty of someone who wanted to say something and didn't know if he was permitted, finally said it. Ma'am, he said, did you see the Raptors on the taxiway when you landed? She stopped walking, not dramatically, just the pause of someone who decides for one moment to stand still instead of moving. I saw them, she said. Word travels fast on a military airfield, he said, apologetic as though she might be offended. It does, she agreed. Do you know which pilots they were? No. Captain Orozco and First Lieutenant Park. Orozco flew as a student under Major Halston, who flew his last deployment alongside. Lindqvist stopped, recalibrated. He knew the story. Apparently he's told it to everyone in his squadron when he saw the manifest. He didn't need to do that, she said. No, ma'am, a pause, but he did. She resumed walking. Lindqvist kept pace. When I retire, she said after a moment, not looking at him, speaking in the flat, measured tone she used for statements that were not intended to be discussed further, I will probably think about that more than most of the missions. Lindqvist said nothing. He understood correctly that this was the most personal statement she was going to make and that the correct response was silence. They reached the vehicle. She put her bag in. She got in. The airman who was driving asked if she needed anything before they went to the hotel. No, she said, let's go. Colorado Springs resolved in the rear window as they pulled out of the installation. The mountains were clear today, the front range sharp against the blue sky with the specific clarity that followed cold fronts. She had flown in this airspace years ago. She would fly in it again from Nellie's in the weeks ahead when she needed to understand what she was asking her pilots to do before she asked them to do it. She watched the mountains until they turned a corner and the installation obscured the view. If you've ever been in a room where the story arrived before you did, where people already knew your name and it carried weight you didn't put there, leave a comment below. We read every one. And if you're watching from Colorado, from Peterson, from Nellie's, from anywhere the flag flies at the end of an active flight line, we see you. We're glad you're here. She flew to Nellie's the following week in the backseat of a T-38 Talon, because the logistics of getting there commercially would have added 6 hours to the transit time and she had work to do. The pilot in the front seat was a young captain who flew with the careful precision of someone who was aware acutely of who was sitting behind him. He did not make small talk. He flew a textbook route, standard altitudes, procedure-perfect transitions. She watched the Nevada desert unroll below them and made no comment. They were 30 miles out from Nellie's when the tower frequency carried a brief exchange that she caught through the headset. The tower controller confirming their inbound, and then a second transmission from the ground, a voice she didn't recognize, clipped and casual. Copy that. Let the Wraith know the squadron's ready to stand up. The captain in the front seat said nothing. He continued flying his textbook approach. She keyed her intercom. Did you hear that? Yes, ma'am. That was inappropriate radio discipline. Yes, ma'am, a beat. It was also the crew chief. He's been with the 64th for 11 years. He tends to say what he means. She considered this. What's his name? Master Sergeant Kowalski. He'll be in your hangar when we land. She filed this away. A crew chief who had survived 11 years in an underperforming squadron and still had the presence of mind to welcome an incoming commander on the tower frequency, with a precision of language that implied he knew what the squadron needed and was glad it was coming. This was a man she needed to talk to before she talked to almost anyone else. The Talon touched down at Nellie's with the particular firmness of desert tarmac in winter. She climbed out of the rear cockpit and stood on the flight line and felt Nevada's thin winter air on her face and looked at the squadron building 100 yards away. Master Sergeant Kowalski was standing beside the building's entrance with his arms at his sides and his chin at a precise angle. He was 53 years old, built like someone who had spent 3 decades around aircraft engines, and he had the expression of a man who had been waiting a long time for something and had decided, upon its arrival, to show up properly. She walked toward him. He did not move until she was 10 feet away, at which point he came to attention and rendered a salute with the crispness of someone who had been waiting 11 years to render it to the right person. She returned it. Master Sergeant Kowalski. Ma'am, welcome to the 64th. Thank you. She looked at the building. Tell me what you see. He blinked just once, and she saw it, the recognition of someone who knew in that moment that he was talking to a person who asked questions in order to receive information, not in order to perform the act of asking. I see a squadron that knows it's capable and has been told for 18 months that it isn't, he said. I see pilots who have started to believe the assessment. I see maintainers who do excellent work and have watched the culture around them contract. A pause. I see 26 people who need someone to tell them what they actually are. And what are they? Aggressors, he said. The best enemies our pilots will ever fight. Their entire job is to be harder than the threat, smarter than the doctrine, and more adaptive than the tactics book. He paused again, and something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but the acknowledgement of a conclusion. They just need a commanding officer who runs the same program. She looked at him for a moment, then, walk with me. They walked the flight line together in the Nevada winter, and she asked questions and he answered them. And by the time they had completed one circuit, she had more operational clarity about the 64th Aggressor Squadron than any of the briefing documents had provided, because the briefing documents had been written by people analyzing from the outside, and Kowalski had been inside for 11 years, and the difference between those two data sources was the difference between a map and the actual terrain. When do the pilots come in? She said. Formation briefing at 0700, he said. First flight is at 0830. I'll be there at 0600. Yes, ma'am, he paused. They'll hear you were here early. I know, she said, that's why I'll be here early. She walked back toward the operations building. The Nevada sky was enormous, the particular enormity of desert skis where the absence of terrain gives the atmosphere room to be itself. She had flown under bigger skis than this. She had also flown under smaller ones. What mattered was not the sky but what you did with the altitude it gave you. The squadron met her at 0700 and she spoke to them for exactly 12 minutes. She said, I have read your evaluations, your training records, your DACT metrics, and your commander's reports for the last 24 months. I have not read them to find out why you've been underperforming. I've read them to understand what you were working with. Silence. Here is what I found. Your aircraft are maintained at an above-average standard. Your individual pilot skills on the metrics that don't depend on institutional systems are competitive with any aggressor unit in the Air Force. What you have been given is a culture that measured the wrong things, rewarded the wrong behaviors, and I will be direct because I think you deserve directness, has allowed institutional comfort to become more important than operational excellence. She looked around the room, 26 faces, different ages, different backgrounds, different expressions, but the same thing underneath, the particular alertness of people who had been waiting to be told the truth. That changes today, she said. Not because I said it does, because we're going to build something here that's worth being part of. And by the time I'm done, every adversary pilot who goes through this program will walk away believing they have fought the hardest enemy they will ever see, because that is the only outcome that justifies what aggressors do. A pause. Questions. One hand, a young lieutenant in the second row with the specific expression of someone who decides, in the moment, to risk asking the real question rather than the safe one. Ma'am, what's your call sign? She looked at him, Wraiths. The lieutenant nodded. Behind him, she saw it move through the room, the word landing differently in a room of pilots than it landed on manifests or in briefing documents. She had not offered context. She had not explained the word's origin or history. She had simply confirmed the name. She did not need to explain it. In a room of military pilots, call signs carried their own documentation. Good, she said, 0830 first flight. I'll be in the air with the lead element. She flew for the next 3 weeks before she grounded herself for 4 days to do nothing but sit with data, read every training record, and build the rebuild plan that General Harmon had asked for. She flew not because a commanding officer needed to prove herself, she was past that requirement, but because she could not build a syllabus for pilots whose actual behavior she hadn't seen from the same altitude. What she saw was exactly what Kowalski had told her, capability that had been taught to doubt itself. Pilots who flew technically well and tactically conservatively, because the previous culture had rewarded not being wrong over being right. Aggressors who were not quite aggressive because someone had, somewhere along the way, confused caution with professionalism. She corrected this with the precision of someone who had learned from her father that imprecision was an ethical failure. She flew against the lead element herself and beat them twice before losing to a third-year captain who had figured out, mid-flight, that she was actually trying to lose rather than letting him win, and had adjusted accordingly and earned it. After that flight, she had walked back to the debrief room and said to the captain, "You figured it out." "Yes, ma'am," he said. He was 29. He looked slightly stunned. "How?" "You started setting up for a reversal at your 3 o'clock and there was no threat there. You were creating a vulnerability deliberately. And I took it because it was there." "What's your call sign?" "Torch, ma'am." She nodded once. "You fly with the lead element from Monday." The culture shifted in 6 weeks. Not completely. Institutional cultures did not shift completely in 6 weeks, and she had not told General Harmon it would. What shifted was the center of gravity, the implicit understanding within the squadron of what was valued and what was not. That shift moved quietly, the way real changes always moved, through the decisions that people made when no one was officially watching, through the conversations in the crew room after hours, through the way the senior pilots talked about maneuvers, through the increasing precision of the debrief language, through Kowalski's maintainers who had started arriving 10 minutes earlier because the operational tempo had begun to feel worth it. At the 90-day mark, she submitted her rebuilding plan to General Harmon's office. The executive summary was 3 paragraphs. The full document was 52 pages. She did not pad it with language designed to make it look thorough. It was thorough because she had done thorough work, and the documentation reflected the work rather than replacing it. General Harmon's response came back within 18 hours. Approved, proceed, well done. She read the message at her desk at 05:45 on a Tuesday morning, with the Nevada desert outside her office window just beginning to catch the first light. and she felt the specific satisfaction of a problem that had been identified, engaged, and measurably improved. Not solved, institutional problems were not solved. They were managed through sustained application of correct force, but improved. Measurably, demonstrably improved. She closed the message and pulled up the next day's flight schedule. The story of the F-22 salute on the taxiway in Colorado Springs circulated through the military aviation community in the way that such stories circulated, told pilot to pilot, unit to unit, gaining detail in some tellings and losing it in others, but retaining at its core the image that made it matter. Two Raptor pilots, canopies open, standing in the Colorado cold for a woman in civilian clothes who didn't wave back. She heard versions of the story 3 times in the months that followed, and each time it had changed. In one version, there were 4 Raptors. In another version, she had acknowledged the salute by tapping the aircraft window with 2 fingers. In a third version, and this was her favorite because it was the version that had traveled farthest from any possible source, one of the pilots had been a former student who had failed his first DACT evaluation under her command and had asked to retake it, and she had made him fly the scenario again, and he had passed, and the salute was for that. "That's not what happened," said Captain Orozco, who had found himself at Nellie's for a conference 4 months after Colorado Springs and had been steered toward her by a combination of the small world of military aviation and the specific inevitability of stories finishing themselves. "I didn't know you from a training scenario. I knew you from what Halston told me." "What did Halston tell you?" They were standing on the Nellie's flight line in the early evening, the Nevada sky doing its full-color performance behind the mountains to the west. Orozco was 28, precise in his movements, with the specific quality of attention that belonged to pilots who were very good and knew they had more to learn. "He told me about Kandahar," Orozco said, "the 2011 operation. He was the company commander for the Unit U." "I know what operation," she said. "He said," Orozco stopped, chose his words with care. "He said that when things were at the point where everyone else's math said there was no coverage, there was a call on the radio. And then there was an aircraft, and the aircraft stayed long after the math said it should have left." She said nothing. "He said that when they extracted, there were 17 members of his unit alive who should have been dead. He told me he'd been trying to find a way to say thank you for 10 years and couldn't figure out how because he didn't have the right forum." "The Raptor salute was his idea," she said. "It was not quite a question." "He knew someone who had access to the manifest," Orozco said. "He couldn't be there himself. He's at Fort Bragg now. He's got a battalion. But he wanted," Orozco paused again, working through the complexity of someone else's intention. "He wanted there to be a moment, a visible moment, because he said there was never a visible moment when it happened. That it was just what it was, and then it was over, and you were gone, and there was no moment where it was acknowledged." She looked at the mountains. The last light was doing what it did in Nevada, turning everything amber and then suddenly gone, with none of the gradual transition that other landscapes provided. "Tell Halston," she said after a moment, "that it was noted." "Ma'am." "Tell him it was noted." She turned from the mountains. "That's enough. That's more than enough." Orozco nodded. He understood the way pilots learned to understand things that were communicated in economy rather than volume, that this was the complete statement. There would be no elaboration. The elaboration would dilute it. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Good flying today," she said, because he had been in the 3rd flight rotation and she had been watching from the tower, and his BFM setup had been clean in a way that suggested he'd been practicing the specific drill she'd made mandatory at the 64th. "You adjusted your entry geometry in the 2nd engagement." He blinked. "You saw that." "I see everything, Captain." She picked up her helmet bag. "That's the job." She walked back toward the operations building. Behind her, Orozco stood for a moment on the flight line, watching her walk away with the particular quality of someone who has just understood something that had previously existed only as legend. Then he walked back to his quarters and sent Halston a message that said, "She says it was noted." Halston read the message at 6 in the morning at Fort Bragg and sat with it for a while before he did anything else. She commanded the 64th Aggressor Squadron for 3 years, which was the standard rotation, and then she was given a wing, and the wing was given to her because she had turned the 64th into something that other commanders sent their pilots to specifically because they wanted them challenged, and the Air Force had noticed. And the Air Force had decided that the particular quality of noticing she brought to every problem was worth giving more problems to. She flew throughout. She never stopped flying. This was not standard for wing commanders, many of whom transitioned fully to the administrative requirements of command and left the cockpit to their subordinates. She flew because she believed, with the specific conviction of someone who had formed a belief from evidence rather than preference, that you could not build a culture of excellence in a flying organization if the commanding officer did not understand from lived and current experience what it meant to fly. The desk was real, the administration was real, the politics were real. But the primary product of an aviation unit was aviation, and if she stopped understanding aviation from the inside, she would stop being able to build the culture that produced it. Kowalski had transferred to Nelly's when the 64th went up in caliber, transferred not because he was ordered to, but because he had decided after 11 years at the same installation that the work ahead was more interesting than the work behind, and had arranged his own reassignment through the specific influence of a master sergeant who understood institutional systems well enough to navigate them when motivated. She noticed his arrival on the personnel roster and said nothing about it directly. She had learned that Kowalski communicated best when he was not the object of direct attention. 3 days after he arrived, she walked past the flight line at 0530 and found him doing the aircraft inspection that the crew's morning shift was not yet present to conduct, because he had characteristically arrived before anyone expected. "Master Sergeant," she said. "Ma'am," he said, not looking up from the inspection panel. She watched him work for 30 seconds, then, "Good morning." "Yes, ma'am," he said, "it is." She left him to the aircraft and went to her office and felt, in a way she did not analyze in detail, that something was correctly arranged. She retired at 56. This was later than many of her contemporaries and earlier than some, and the timing was determined by the intersection of two things: her body, which had finally registered 28 years of ejection seat vibration and high G, maneuvering in the form of a spinal issue that could be managed on the ground and complicated in the cockpit, and a project at the Air Force Academy that had been waiting, formally and informally, for someone with her particular history to come and build it. The DACT curriculum development was not glamorous work in the way that a wing command was glamorous or a combat deployment was glamorous. It was patient, detailed, iterative, the work of someone who understood that the pilots who would fight the next war needed to be taught by people who had fought the last ones, and that the methodology for that teaching was not yet written in a form that could outlast the people who held it in their heads. She wrote it down. She spent 4 years writing it down with the precision of someone who understood that imprecision was an ethical failure. She worked with instructors and pilots and maintainers and the occasional civilian academic who was studying how military institutions transmitted tacit knowledge across generations. She was patient with the academics who were asking the right questions but often in the wrong language, and she learned to translate. The curriculum was adopted by the Air Force Education and Training Command in its second year of pilot testing, and was subsequently shared with Allied Air Forces through a NATO exchange program. She did not attend the adoption ceremony, because by then she was already working on the third revision, which addressed gaps that the first year of implementation had revealed. "You're not going to go watch them adopt it," said the young major who had become her research assistant and who still, 18 months into working for her, had not entirely learned when to ask questions. "They're not adopting it to watch me watch them adopt it," she said. "They're adopting it to teach pilots. The pilots are the point." The young major was quiet for a moment. "Then, is that the whole reason?" She looked at him. He was learning, which was the important thing. The question was awkward, but it was asking for the real answer rather than the acceptable one, and she respected that. "There's a photograph at the ceremony," she said, "with the general and the curriculum developer. I don't want to be in photographs at ceremonies." "Why not?" "Because when someone is looking for the curriculum in 20 years, they'll look in the files, not at the photograph, and I want the curriculum to be findable." She returned to her screen. "The photograph is for the people who made decisions that led to the curriculum being adopted. I made the curriculum. The two things don't need to be documented in the same image." The major thought about this. That's actually a very specific philosophy." "Yes," she said, "it is. Go get me the second quarter assessment data." He went. She died at 78 in her sleep, in an apartment in Colorado Springs that she had chosen specifically, because from certain windows you could see the flight line at Peterson. Not to watch it compulsively, she was past that, had been past it for years, but because the presence of an active flight line was a specific kind of company she had never stopped finding comfort in. The sound of engines in the distance. The particular smell of the Front Range winter. The knowledge that the work continued, carried now by people she had trained and people trained by people she had trained, the knowledge passing forward through the chain that she had spent 28 years helping build. She had not remarried after the divorce at 31. Which had been amicable in the specific way of two people who had agreed that one of them was not available in the ways a marriage required. and had respected each other enough to acknowledge it rather than continuing to construct something around an absence. She had not been lonely. Loneliness was a specific condition she had examined carefully, and concluded required a particular kind of unmet need that she did not in fact have. She had been solitary. She had been at various times precisely occupied by work that mattered. These were not the same thing as loneliness. The funeral was attended by generals, colonels, the current commanding officer of the 64th Aggressor Squadron, the retired Kowalski who flew in from Florida at 81, the specific stubbornness of someone who had decided that this occasion warranted the trip, and 6 people who had been members of Captain Halston's unit in Kandahar in 2011, who had coordinated their own attendance through a communication thread that had existed for 17 years and that had been used on significant occasions to make sure someone from the unit was present when it mattered. Halston himself spoke. He was 64 and had retired as a brigadier general, and he spoke for 7 minutes without notes because what he had to say was not the kind of thing that needed notes. He said, "I have been asked over the years to describe what it was like when the radio finally crackled and the voice came through, when we knew that there was an aircraft up there, even though by every calculation there shouldn't have been. I have tried different words for this, and none of them are quite right. What I know is that 17 people who should have been dead walked out of that valley. What I know is that the reason they walked out was a woman who, by that point, had no authorization, no communications, no engine that was behaving as advertised, and no logical reason to stay. What I know is that she stayed." He paused. She always stayed. That was the thing in every version of the story, and there are many versions. The constant is that she stayed past the point where staying was the reasonable choice. She had calculated that the staying mattered more than the leaving. She was always right. That's not luck. That's 28 years of building the judgment to know which calculation is the one that counts. He paused again, longer this time. "I never adequately thanked her. I tried once through intermediaries and she sent back 3 words. It was noted. That's all she ever wanted, to have it noted. Not celebrated, not memorialized, just noted so that the record was accurate and the work could continue." He sat down. The A-10 Thunderbolt II that she had flown in her 4th and 5th deployments, tail number 790168, which the crew chiefs had called persistent, because it had survived 3 separate episodes of battle damage that should have grounded it permanently, was retired to the National Museum of the United States Air Force at Wright-Patterson in 2019. The placard on the aircraft included, at the request of the museum's curation committee and with the coordination of several veterans organizations, a reference to Wraith and the specific deployment that had become, in the operational community, the definitional account of what the aircraft was capable of doing in the hands of someone who understood it. The damage that had been documented at that depot inspection, the hydraulic line that had been held together by accumulated corrosion rather than structural integrity, the wing spar stress fractures that should have produced a fatal departure from controlled flight, the oil system blockage that had somehow not starved the remaining engine, was described in the placard with the dry precision of museum documentation. Children walked past it bored, not understanding what they were looking at. Veterans paused longer, reading the placard, remembering. She had visited the museum once before the aircraft was installed, had seen it in the transport configuration, before the restoration team had completed their work. She had stood next to the fuselage for 3 minutes without saying anything. The crew chief who was accompanying the transport had stayed a respectful distance away, having been briefed by someone in the veterans organization that this was a specific relationship between a specific person and a specific aircraft, and the appropriate response to witnessing it was silence. She had placed her hand on the fuselage once briefly. Then she had walked away. She did not go to the installation ceremony. She sent a letter to the museum's director that thanked the restoration team by name and requested that the tail number be correctly documented on the placard. It was. The 64th Aggressor Squadron, at the time of her death, was ranked first in the Air Force's annual training effectiveness assessment for the 4th consecutive year. The commanding officer, a colonel who had been a captain when Myra took command, who had been Torch, who had figured out the deliberate vulnerability in mid-flight and earned his spot in the lead element, issued a unit communication to every pilot and maintainer in the squadron on the morning of her funeral. It said, "Colonel Voss built what you have inherited. You honor that inheritance by flying better today than you flew yesterday. That's all." He did not need to add anything else. The squadron understood. The call sign Wraith persisted in the operational community in the specific way that call signs persisted, adopted informally as shorthand for a certain quality of presence, a certain combination of precision and commitment and willingness to stay past the point of reasonable calculation. It was used to describe moments rather than people, usually. That was a Wraith moment, meaning a moment when someone had stayed when they could have left. when the math said go and the mission said stay. Orozco, Captain Orozco, then Major Orozco, eventually Colonel Orozco, who eventually commanded a wing of his own, used it this way throughout his career. He had told the story of the Colorado Springs taxiway to every pilot he had ever mentored, and in his telling the story always ended the same way. She didn't wave back. She saw us. She acknowledged it, but she didn't perform it because that wasn't the point. The point, he said in every version, was that she had work to do. The salute was for her. The mission was hers. She knew the difference. He had learned, eventually, what he had not understood on the flight line at Nellie's when she said it was noted. That to have something noted precisely and accurately and without embellishment was not a small thing. It was the only thing, for someone who had spent 28 years building truth in the places where truth was most expensive. It was noted, it was all she ever wanted, and it was, by that standard, everything. They told stories about the specific way she always entered an aircraft, right hand on the canopy rail, pause, scan the horizon once before she swung her leg over. Some said it was superstition. Some said it was habit. Some said it was neither, that it was simply someone who had learned at the age of 12 on a Sarajevo rooftop that the job was always to see. But what they remembered most was something simpler than any of the stories: the quality of her presence. The particular certainty that when things were at the point where everyone's math said there was no coverage, she would arrive, that the aircraft on the horizon would resolve into her, that the call sign would come through the static. When you needed her, she emerged like a wraith out of the clouds, exactly when hope was fading, exactly when it mattered most. And that, more than any medal or commendation or ceremony or the placard on the aircraft at Wright-Patterson or the salute on a Colorado taxiway or anything else that accumulated over 56 years of service and a lifetime devoted to precision, was what made her irreplaceable. She had stayed, she had always stayed. That was noted. That was enough. If this story reached something in you, the idea of someone who showed up exactly when the math said they shouldn't have, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you're watching from Wright-Patterson, from Nellie's, from Colorado Springs, from Sarajevo, or from anywhere that has ever asked someone to stay past the point of reason, this one is for you. Subscribe and we'll see you in the next story.